Last week, I told you about the black tax, $600 million for white-owned firms, and $1 billion campaign built on black loyalty. I also gave you a name, Mike Rogers, and I told you that a Texas oil billionaire was spending $67 million to buy Mike Rogers a Michigan Senate seat. Well, that was the headline. Tonight, I'm giving you the file, because here's what I left out. I told you who was buying the seat, but I didn't tell you what Mike Rogers was worth before they started writing the checks. And I definitely didn't tell you what he was worth after. $655,000. That's what Mike Rogers had when he left the United States Congress in January 2015. 14 years of public service, an FBI agent, state senator, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. After, $17.5 million. That's what he reported when he came back to run for Senate in 2023. Same man, no company founded, no patent filed, no inheritance, no lottery. $655,000 to $17.5 million. The distance between these two numbers is the entire story. Every language on earth has a word for this kind of enrichment. The Greeks call it kleptocracy. The English language has a dozen words for it. Graft, corruption, self-dealing, the revolving door. We have named it in every tongue in every century since the invention of public office. But the United States Congress, they have no law that prevents it. And I'm going to walk you through every dollar of it tonight. And by the time I'm done, you'll not need a law to know what this is. You'll just need common sense. This is Burn the Playbook. Here's the math. $655,000 to $17.5 million in 9 years. 23 board seats and consulting arrangements. All of them in the defense, intelligence, and telecom industries. The same industries his committee used to oversee. That is a 2,669% return. 2,669%. The S&P 500 did about 100% in those 9 years. It's a pretty good investment. A great year for your 401k. Real estate in Michigan did about 60%. Your house, if you were lucky, it probably did a little less than that. Mike Rogers, he did over 2,000%. Not from building something, not from inventing something, not from risking his own money on a company that might fail. From board seats, handed to him by the same people whose budget he used to control. That number, over 2,000%, is not a return on investment. It's a return on access. And I want you to hold it in your head as I walk through the names on the receipt, because each one is worse than the last. Let's take a look. The Mitra Corporation. He collected $191,000 and then became chairman of the board of a federally funded research center, one that runs some of the most sensitive programs in the defense and intelligence community. Funded by the budget he used to oversee, the committee allocates the money, the member retires, and then he takes a chairman's seat at the organization the money flows to. That's not a second career. It's a toll booth. Here's another one. Nokia, $460,000. For what? Nobody knows. His campaign refused to explain what the payment was for. Nokia declined to comment, and the disclosure rules required you to list the payment, but not the service. Think about that. That's like requiring a bank robber to file a receipt for the getaway car and then telling the police they can't ask where he drove it. $460,000. Services. Unknown. Questions? Not welcome. IronNet cybersecurity. Now listen to this carefully. He collected $724,887, nearly $750,000. The company was co-founded by Keith Alexander, the former director of the National Security Agency, same NSA that Rogers oversaw on the House Intelligence Committee. The spy chief and the committee chair. They both leave government. Both end up on the same corporate board selling cybersecurity services. Back to the intelligence community that they both just left. The company went public through a SPAC, a special purpose acquisition company. They're confusing, but I'll get to it. For anyone who doesn't understand it, a SPAC is a blank check. Investors give you money before you've proven anything. You can go public without the scrutiny of a traditional IPO. And the people at the top get paid whether the company succeeds or not. Sound familiar? IronNet hit a $3 billion valuation. $3 billion. Because a 4-star general and a House Intelligence chairman put their names on it. Retail investors, school teachers, veterans, retirees, People who saw those names and believed them, well, they bought in. And then the company slashed revenue guidance by 60%. Class action securities fraud lawsuits commenced. All 104 employees, they were terminated. And there was a suit for $6.6 million. The retail investors were wiped out. But somehow, Mike Rogers kept his $750,000. That's how the revolving door works. You don't need the actual company to succeed. You just need to get paid before it fails. The little man, always getting screwed. IronNet, it wasn't an anomaly. It was the model. The SPAC boom of 2020 and 2021 was a gold rush for Washington insiders. Former generals, committee chairs, cabinet officials, they lent their names, their clearances, and their Rolodexes to companies that had no revenue, no product, and frankly, no plan. They went public and they cashed out. And ordinary Americans, the ones who trusted those names, who believed that a 4-star general would not have put his reputation behind a shell game, well, they got destroyed. But Mike Rogers, he didn't get destroyed. He benefited. Almost $250,000 from a company that no longer exists. And then AT&T. This is really the one that's going to keep you up at night. In 2012, Rogers, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, ran a high-profile investigation into a Chinese company called Huawei. The Chinese telecom giant is notorious. He hauled them before Congress and basically called them a national security threat, called them a threat to the American people, and he ended up on cable news. Mike Rogers, the China hawk, protecting America. Well, 2 years later, he leaves Congress. AT&T hires him as their chief security advisor. And at the exact time he takes the paycheck, AT&T was actively trying to broker deals to sell Huawei. That's right, Huawei equipment in the United States, the very same Huawei equipment that he called a threat to the American people on national television. 2 of his former chiefs of staff, well, they built the bridge. They went to work at AT&T's lobbying firm and connected the man who screamed about Huawei in congressional hearings to the company that wanted to sell Huawei to Americans. You can't make this up. He never disclosed his AT&T salary. Not one penny of it appears on the public record. I want you to understand what this means for national security. This isn't abstract. This is specific. When the chairman of the Intelligence Committee identifies a threat on national television, the country listens. You listen, I listen, soldiers listen, intelligence officers listen. The supply chain adjusts. Billions of dollars in procurement decisions are shaped by that testimony. It matters. And when that same chairman retires and takes a paycheck from the company selling that threat, what does the next chairman do? What does the next witness say? What does the next intelligence officer think when he is asked to testify honestly about a company that might hire him in 2 years? The people who identify the threats become the people who profit from them. And eventually, no one can tell the difference between a warning and a sales pitch. Well, after he retired, Mike Rogers took his leftover campaign money Michigan voters gave him to run for Congress. They worked hard for that, and he converted it into a PAC, and he called it Securing America's Future, patriotic. He then created a new organization. It was an organization he said was for peace and prosperity. Well, he transferred over $860,000. Now, who staffed this patriotic organization? Stephen Hadley, who sat on the board of Raytheon. Who else? John Engler, a lobbyist for Lockheed Martin. And Rogers' former chief of staff, Andy Kaiser, who he paid $116,333 as the director. Campaign money paid for this from Michigan voters, funneled through a PAC into a defense industry advocacy group staffed by defense industry insiders. And it paid their salaries. If a plumber did this with your deposit, you would call the police. But when a congressman does it with your campaign contributions, he gets to call it peace, prosperity, and security. Make it make sense. I can't. This is Burn the Playbook. Last week, I introduced you to the donors. I gave you the names and the dollar amounts. Well, tonight, I want to show you the pattern. Because once you see not just who's writing the checks, but why, this stops looking like a campaign and starts looking like a leveraged buyout. Steven Schwarzman, Blackstone, $1 trillion under management, more capital than the GDP of Saudi Arabia. He put in $2 million plus $7,000 personally to Mike Rogers. Ken Griffin, Citadel, $65 billion under management. He gave $2.5 billion. Paul Singer, Elliott Management, $69 billion under management. The man they called the vulture capitalist. He buys distressed sovereign debt and sues entire countries to collect $50,000. But Singer does not write small checks by accident. Elliott is also the top source of contributions to the National Republican Senatorial Committee. And when Paul Singer gives, he gives. Last week, I introduced you to the donors. I gave you the names and the dollar amounts. Tonight, I want to show you the pattern. Because once you see not just who's writing the checks, but why, this stops looking like a campaign and starts looking like a leveraged buyout. Let me give you some refreshment. Steven Schwarzman, Blackstone, $1 trillion under management, more capital than the GDP of Saudi Arabia. Well, he put in $2 million plus $7,000 directly to Rogers. Ken Griffin, Citadel, $65 billion under management. He donated $2.5 million. Paul Singer, Elliott Management, $69 billion under management. The man they call the vulture capitalist. He buys distressed sovereign debt and sues entire countries to collect. He gave $50,000. Now, Singer doesn't write small checks by accident. You see, Elliott is also the Last week, I introduced you to the donors. I gave you the names and the dollar amounts. Tonight, I want to show you the pattern. Because once you see not just who's writing the checks, but you actually understand why, the midterms stop looking like a campaign and start looking like a leveraged buyout. Steven Schwarzman, head of Blackstone, $1 trillion under management. That's more capital than the GDP of Saudi Arabia. He put in $2 million plus $7,000 directly to Mike Rogers. Ken Griffin of Citadel, $65 billion under management. He gave $2.5 million. Paul Singer, Elliott Management, $69 billion under management. He's the man that they call the vulture capitalist. He buys distressed sovereign debt and sues entire countries just to collect $50,000. Now, Singer doesn't write small checks by accident. Elliott Management is also the top source of contributions to the National Republican Senatorial Committee. When Paul Singer gives you a $50,000 check, it's not a donation, it's a receipt. And he has you on file. Mark Rowan, Apollo Global Management, $700 billion under management. $7,000 directly to Rogers. Foreman, $1.9 trillion in combined assets under management. All writing checks to the same Senate candidate. Now I want to ask you a question. Not why billionaires donate. That's how the system works. We have a democracy. The question is, why this man? Why this race? Why Michigan? Well, we know that Mike Rogers wants a seat on the Senate Banking Committee, the committee that regulates banks, the committee that regulates asset managers, the committee that regulates hedge funds, the committee that regulates private equity. Every single one of those donors operates in industries that Mike Rogers' committee would oversee. And here's Rogers' record, because this is not speculation. This is just pure arithmetic. The career total from the securities and investment industries, 1.25 million. Top 11% of all lawmakers in America. Mike Rogers voted twice against Dodd-Frank, the law Congress wrote specifically to prevent another 2008 crash. He supported a bill not written by legislators, but written by banking lobbyists to exempt big banks from post-crash reforms. And before he even got to Washington, as a Michigan state senator, he co-authored the Credit Reform Act, which eliminated interest rate caps on second mortgages and variable rate limits on car financing. He's been voting for their interests, not yours, but theirs, since before most people in Michigan even knew his name. $1.9 trillion in combined assets, writing checks to a man who has never once voted against them. That doesn't sound like a donation to me. That sounds like, at best, an investment portfolio. Now, let me show you where this man lives, and not in a creepy way. But the address and location tell you everything that the donor list has already told you. Remember, 20% of Mike Rogers' donors are from Michigan. 20%. 53%, well, they're from out of state. 42 are from Virginia. That's 42% from Virginia, the Beltway donor class, where consultants and defense contractors live. It's the orbit of Washington power, people who never, ever set foot in an assembly plant. Well, surprise, Mike Rogers, after leaving Congress, well, he moved to Cape Coral, Florida, a $1.7 million mansion, almost 5,000 square feet, and he even filed for a homestead exemption, which under Florida law means you're telling the state of Florida, this is where I live. He pulled a $325,000 renovation permit, registered to vote in Florida. And when he decided to run for Senate in Michigan, he bought a 1-bedroom, 728 square foot house. Hold those numbers. Almost 5,000 square foot mansion versus a 728 square foot lot. Basically a lot, because no one had ever lived there. He stayed at his sister's house in Genoa Township. And his voter registration, well, that wasn't canceled until reporters started asking in November 2025. He told a Michigan audience that basically his whole life was in Florida. Well, except for the place he wants to run out of. Now, I've said a lot of things in my career in politics that I wish I could take back, but I've never said my whole life is here while standing in a different state and asking them to vote for us. It's a hell of a tactic. I want you to see what this actually is, though. This isn't Mike Rogers, the candidate. This is Mike Rogers, the structure. You see, in 2010, the Supreme Court decided Citizens United. You're going to hear about that a lot. The majority opinion said that independent expenditures do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. That was the sentence. That was the legal reasoning. Independent money cannot corrupt. Bullshit. This is what the sentence looks like in actual practicality. Not a legal doctrine, not a law review article, not an opinion delivered from a marble bench by justices who will never run for office and, accept millions of dollars in trips from lobbyists as well. That's right. This is what it looks like. A man living in Florida who buys a 1-bedroom in Michigan so he can have a filing address. He raises 80% of his money from people who don't live in the state he wants to represent. He has $1.9 trillion in combined donor assets, pointing at that committee seat. And they're writing the checks to fund it. It's not corruption, according to the United States Supreme Court, because the money is independent. The man's not independent. The money's independent. The committee assignment, sure as hell, isn't independent. The votes aren't independent. But the checks, they're written to a super PAC, not a campaign account. And so the Supreme Court of the United States has decided somehow that's independent and that's democracy. Make it make sense. This is Burn the Playbook. All right, it's time for some fun. I promised you a receipt, so here it is. Mike Rogers left Congress worth $655,000. 9 years and 23 board seats later, it's worth $17.5 million. In 2024, he ran for the same Michigan Senate seat. Total spending on the race, $250 million. Well, he lost by 19,000 votes. So he came back with more money. Let's start at the top. The Senate leadership fund. Mitch McConnell's operation. They committed $45 million to the race. The largest, earliest SLF investment in Michigan history. Tim Dunn, remember him? $5 million. Ken Griffin, $2.5 million. Stephen Schwartzman, $2 million. The Koch network, otherwise known as the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity Action, $1.5 million in media buys. General Atomics, the drone manufacturer, his top 2024 donor, $275,000. Paul Singer, $50,000. Total outside spending, $67 million and climbing for one Senate seat in one state for a man who lives in Florida. Combined assets under management of his top 4 billionaire donors, $1.9 trillion. Banking committee seat, yeah, he wants it. Donors from Michigan, 20%. Donors from out of state, 53%. His mansion in Florida, 1.7 million. 4,751 square feet. His house in Michigan, $295,000, 728 square feet. He's never lived in it, but this isn't a campaign. It's a leveraged buyout. It's legal bribery. And the people of Michigan, they're not the shareholders. They're the assets being acquired. So Michigan, what are you going to do about it? This is Burn the Playbook. I want to end tonight where the money never reaches. See, there's a woman in Flint right now. I don't know her name, but I know her kitchen. I know the faucet that she hasn't turned on in 11 years. I know the case of bottled water on the floor next to her refrigerator, the one that she has to buy every week. I know that her grandchildren, they know not to drink from that very tap because she had to teach them that before they were old enough to read. And I know that her water bill still shows up every month. I know her property taxes still have to get paid every month. But she still votes every cycle, rain or shine, because someone told her that's how you change things. And she believes them. And she's never stopped believing, even after 11 years of buying water in a country that somehow sent a rover to Mars. Her water bill is $80 a month. That's for waters that she can't even drink. Mike Rogers' renovation budget, that's $327,000 for a mansion that he already owns in a state that he moved to while also running for Senate in a different state. Her vote, it's worth one. His donors, well, they have $1.9 trillion. $67 million came from New York and Texas and Virginia and Florida. And it's about to decide who represents her in the United States Senate. Not $1 of that $67 million is going to fix her pipes. It's not going to fix her water. Mike Rogers lost this Senate race once. He lost by 19,000 voters, $250 million behind him. And Michigan saw straight through it. The voters in Flint and Detroit and Lansing and Grand Rapids looked at the money and looked at Mike Rogers and said, absolutely not. But the question is whether they're going to see through it again, especially when the money's bigger and when the machine is louder and when the man who asked for their vote still doesn't live in that state. And when the people writing the checks have decided that $19,000, or rather 19,000 votes, well, that's a rounding error that they can probably purchase. Now, last week, I told you about the black tax, the way that both parties extract loyalty from the people who empower them, and then they return nothing to the very communities that delivered it. This week, I showed you what the other side of the extraction looks like. A man who took 14 years of public trust and converted it into $17.5 million in private wealth. And now $67 million from 4 billionaires is trying to buy his way right back into that very building. And the thread that connects these two episodes is the same thread that runs through almost every story this show is going to tell. The system extracts from the people it claims to represent. And these receipts, they're public. They're on FEC.gov. They're in congressional disclosures. They've been there the entire time. Not enough people read them. And that's not a flaw in the system. That is the system. The volume of money is itself the strategy. Not because it buys better ads, but because it makes you believe that the outcome was decided before you even got to the booth. It makes the act of voting feel like a formality. It makes the woman in Flint feel like her one vote cannot possibly matter when it's up against $1.9 trillion. It can. It did once. Actually, it did 19,000 times. So go to fec.gov. It's committee C as in Carter 008-49810. Read the filings, count the addresses. It takes 10 minutes. The $67 million campaign is built on the assumption that you will never look. You could also send this to one person, maybe the teacher in Detroit, the union guy in Flint, the college kid at Michigan who doesn't know that the very man running for Senate once tried to keep students like him or her from voting. It only takes one person, because $67 million is a lot of money, but it only works if nobody reads the receipts. Now, in the next episode, we're going to go deeper into the file. I'm going to look into the wife who ran a military contractor while Mike Rogers investigated Benghazi, or the Saudi deal that Mike Rogers tried to push through, and the 111 votes that started it all. The receipts are all on fec.gov. They're free. They're publicly searchable. But in the meantime, I'm Michael Starr Hopkins, and this is Burn the Playbook.